So again, this one's called Masonic Pub Crawl, Freemasonry in America, and it's Colonial Tavern Beginnings. So it's kind of an honor to be doing this here in kind of what I would call the birthplace of Masonry in the United States. But famous Freemasons and historians both speak fondly about patriotic beginnings of America, and with that, about our fraternity's involvement in those beginnings. In the early 1700s, Freemasons were, as we know, some of the most influential men in society. The public house of the tavern was a common place for men of the day, of all walks of life, that would happen upon and find a comfort in a pint, sometimes a meal. And it was a place where men of every station in society could get together on the level, very much like our own fraternity. So we'll talk about three influential taverns throughout, two of which are here in Massachusetts. But many stories have been told about famous taverns in colonial America, and one in particular many people know about, and for that reason we're going to start with it. And although there is some confusion about its origin and when it became an official lodge, its story is a pretty good one. The Tun Tavern was built in 1685, tun being an Old English word for barrel or keg. It was located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at the corner of Water Street and Tun Alley. And the Tun Tavern was to be the birthplace of several organizations, most famously the United States Marine Corps. On November 10th, 1775, the Continental Congress gave a guy named Sam Nicholas, an innkeeper, orders to raise 2 battalions of Marines in Philadelphia. In those days, you can imagine there's some real contention among the colonists and the British. You have to remember we're dealing with things like the Stamp Act, among other things, which angered colonial Americans considerably, especially since the colonies had no say in the passing of many of the laws and ordinances due to the issue of representation. Because of these tensions and the problems that we were having, the battalions were deemed very necessary. They were especially needed to help solve the problem of securing ships and crews during boarding actions by the British by conducting offensive and defensive combat assignments on a regular basis. At that time, the tavern's manager, Robert MULLAN, was the chief recruiter for the Marines. And it's rumored that volunteers for the Marine service were enticed by a cold round of beer, and you might imagine that they didn't need much else as a perk, since these men saw tyranny that kind of plagued the streets of New England, and many felt that it was time to stand up for something. Captain Nicholas, as he was then known, put together the 1st Continental Marine Corps, which was composed of 100 Rhode Islanders, and he was a Freemason. Now, there were several other organizations that were started in this tavern as well. For instance, 1720, the first meeting of the St. George Society, which was an organization dedicated to helping poor Englishmen coming into the country. The society lives on today under a few names and some other jurisdictional titles, like this one is still in New York. In 1732, this is some Masonic history here, you have the Tun Tavern hosting St. John's Lodge No. 1 in Philadelphia in its first meetings. Oddly enough, it was composed of only entered apprentices and fellowcrafts for our non-Masons. That's the first 2 degrees. We have 3 degrees in Blue Lodge Masonry, as we say. It's not surprising, considering that the master's degree at this time is only conferred in what we call Master Mason lodges. At that point, St. John Lodge was also the place where Benjamin Franklin became a member. The account book of St. John's Lodge No. 1, called the Liber B, there's some conjecture, contentions, whatever you want to call it, about the legitimacy of the document. However, has in its record book the name of William Allen, the first Grand Master. Later on, the lodge was formed, called simply Tun Tavern Lodge No. 3, and the Tun Tavern Lodge and St. John's Lodge eventually moved to a place called the Indian King Hotel. They did something kind of interesting. They decided to hold meetings on alternate days so that there would be a Masonic meeting every day of the week, or I'm sorry, every week in the year. They would hold alternate meetings on the weeks. On Wednesdays, actually. Yes. The Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania recognizes the Tun Tavern as the birthplace of Masonic teaching in America. In fact, the earliest known minutes for a Masonic organization on the North American continent, anyway, are those belonging to Tun Tavern Lodge number 3, it is said. Then 1747, you have the founding of the St. Andrew's Society, which was similar to Society of King George, only this particular society was set up by poor Scotsmen coming into the country. Probably don't need to tell anybody about contentions existing between England and Scotland. Here, this is a coat of arms from Central Illinois, St. Andrew's Society, which still exists, although I think their purpose has changed a little bit over the years, not particularly dealing with immigration. The member rolls of the lodge reports that there were, at the very least, going back to the Tun Tavern Lodge, 87 regular members of this lodge and about 186 visiting members. As for the Tun Tavern Lodge, these are some of the original signatures from the first page of the Tun Tavern Lodge's journal dating from 1749. This document was pulled from JSTOR. If you have any college students or people who went to college, I'm sure you know what JSTOR is. Just a repository of historical documents. Some contentions, according to Henry Coyle, a Freemason from Massachusetts. The Tun Tavern Lodge was never warranted nor issued a charter, is what Henry Coyle says, and he calls them a rather interesting title. I'll put air quotes up. He calls them an immemorial rights lodge. The Tun Tavern itself was burned to the ground in 1781 toward the end of the American Revolution. In fact, today Interstate 95 runs right through where that tavern once stood. If you want to see what the tavern looked like, felt like, you may have a chance to do so. You can travel to Quantico, Virginia. The National Museum of the Marine Corps has a Tun Tavern-themed restaurant which serves lunch, adult beverages, and apparently a famous bread pudding. The next stop on our pub crawl is the Bunch of Grapes. Show of hands, everybody's familiar with Bunch of Grapes in here pretty much? Yeah, we should probably skip it. I'm just kidding. So the Tun Tavern was in operation this tavern was in operation a long time, stretching from the 17th to the 18th centuries. Officially, I've got some documentation showing that it opened its doors in 1712. The Bunch of Grapes Tavern is interesting because it also claims to be the home of St. John Lodge number 1. Why that's significant is, from somebody not from the New England area, we see St. John's Lodge pop up everywhere. And so if you're not completely familiar with the history of lodges, it might appear as though this is the same lodge. However, it is not. This is because, again, it's not just a lodge. It is, in fact, another St. John Lodge, which is recognized as the first Grand Lodge in America, chartered in Boston, 1733. It is also known and recorded in the first English rolls of 1734. So again, a lot of mixing of lodges, locations, admittedly a bit confusing. However, on Monday, July 30th, 1733, the first Grand Lodge of Masons in America was founded by a skilled tailor, a guy named Henry Price, pictures of whom and busts are all over your Grand Lodge building, I might add. It's pretty intense. So Henry Price receives authority to do so from this guy overseas in London, Lord Montague. He is a Grand Master of Masons in London. There is some evidence which suggests that they were operating as a Grand Lodge as early as 1730. And again, I said that they were a Grand Lodge in 1733, but in operation maybe 3 years before actually having any kind of dispensation, also predating a few of the Tun Tavern claims and meeting dates. So it's kind of interesting. Here is the Bunch of Grapes. That's, I believe, right, the same picture I just took. I pulled this picture from the internet, but I took the same picture on my phone just yesterday of these that are hanging just upstairs at your Grand Lodge building. The Bunch of Grapes Tavern had some dark history as well. It was located on King Street, along half a mile of a street where two other taverns, the Royal Exchange and the Crown Coffee House, both were very popular for a drink, but they were also, as I said, at some dark times in our nation's history, slave clearinghouses. The Bunch of Grapes Tavern was not particularly involved with the planning of an American Revolution. However, it was a place of which kind of shifted with the winds, as it were. Here's your Henry Price, the godfather of American Masonry. Some additional replicas, or those may be the actual ones. I'm not entirely sure. You would need to ask Walter, your Grand Lodge historian, that one. One of the organizations that met here is called they called it the Whig Tavern at a point because a political action group called the High Whigs would meet there. They're kind of a snobbish aristocracy. They were nonetheless big money, and at points I would say sympathetic to the cause of the American independence. The picture shown here is art from a modern form of the same party which exists today. So at this point in the British occupation of Boston, British troops had made this a meeting place as well. Sometime later, after the siege of Boston, General George Washington, another famous Mason, Marquis de Lafayette, and a guy named John Stark, not the same one from Iron Man, all of whom were brothers of our craft, were handsomely entertained at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. Again, well-deserved, right? If you aren't familiar with the Siege of Boston, was one of the first chapters of the American Revolution. In short, New England militiamen became the Continental Army and led by Washington in a siege surrounded Boston, Massachusetts, and forced the British to evacuate. How many of you saw the History Channel documentary Sons of Liberty? Anybody? It's pretty interesting. They took some funny artistic license, which was pretty good. Ben Franklin had a really good line midway through I won't repeat here. But it culminates in this very act, the Siege of Boston. And you want the English general who was there, you really wanted him to get it, but he gets away. And if you check your history, he never gets it. He lives out the rest of his life in London and lap of luxury, and he's always rich. Real life never has a tendency to culminate in exactly what you think maybe he should get karmically. However, Paul Revere is frequented the Bunch of Grapes Tavern on various occasions to quench a thirst. One gentleman named Captain Francis Golay described a Bunch of Grapes Tavern as, quote, the best punch house in Boston. The tavern's real contribution to America is its involvement in the forming of one of the first states of our Union. The state was Ohio, and this came about through a group of men and committee members who needed to discuss lands in the Ohio Territory. And by 1787, they passed something called the Northwest Ordinance, and this is the place that they met, at the Bunch of Grapes Tavern. Today, the Bunch of Grapes Tavern is gone. It was actually demolished in 1798. However, there's a memorial plaque there which reads, if you can't read that, it says, the site of Bunch of Grapes Tavern, here on the 30th of July, 1733, was instituted under a charter from the Grand Lodge of England, the first regularly constituted lodge of free and accepted Masons in America, now St. John's Lodge of Boston. Here in 1786 was organized the Ohio Company, pioneer in the development of the Great West under the leadership of General Rufus Putnam, another famous name a lot of guys might know, another Mason. First township laid out at Marietta, Ohio. This tablet placed here in the city of Boston, 30th of July, 1925. So it was the first chartered Grand Lodge really in the New World, but of course there are some rival claims, namely within Pennsylvania. So today nothing is left of this tavern except this plaque, which is on a building standing on State Street. The Green Dragon is our, I guess, quasi-last stop maybe. The Green Dragon Tavern was a tavern located on Boston's north end on Union Street. Originally, this tavern had passed through the hands of several owners throughout the 1700s until 1743 when a guy named William Douglas, who was a physician and a pamphleteer, he bought it and used it as his quote-unquote mansion house. Douglas died in 1752, a mere 9 years after he acquired it. It passed then to his sister, who held on to it for just a few years before she eventually sold it to St. Andrew's Lodge of Freemasons in 66 chartered in 56. What is interesting, St. Andrew's Lodge is working under a Scottish Grand Lodge of Scotland charter. Anyway, the first floor of the building was used for the lodge meetings and some ritual work, but it's when you get to the basement is where it gets a bit interesting. So of the 3 lodges of the taverns that we've talked about, I kind of saved the coolest for the last. The basement of the Green Dragon Tavern was used for the meetings of several secret groups. Of these groups were the Boston Committee of Correspondence. This title of the group doesn't sound very menacing at all, but perhaps by design. This group was actually what some people would call or describe, maybe conspiracy theorists would call a shadow government led by leaders of 13 colonies. This particular location was the first of several correspondence committees, and they were set up to address something known as the Currency Act, which was set up by Parliament in order to stop British merchants from accepting paper currency issued by independent colonies instead of the British pound. So you can already see how that one group kind of really started some serious business, but that wasn't the only group that met at the Green Dragon. You also had the Boston Caucus, another non-threatening sounding name, but this group was also founded in 1719 by a popular physician, Dr. Elijah Cook Jr., but the activities which made the group famous happened under the leadership of none other than Samuel Adams. The group itself and its use of the word caucus was among the first, if not the first, use of the word in its meaning of a group of people meeting together to form a political movement or party to agree on a common position. So while under the influence of Sam Adams, say the man, not the beer, the group was insistent on protecting the rights of Boston's lower and middle classes, as well as protecting popular social programs of the day that would help those same classes. And now comes the more secret groups that met here. You have the Loyal Nine. The Loyal Nine, this of course was a patriot organization shrouded in secrecy. Formed in 1765, 9 like-minded fellows of Boston to protest the passing of the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act, as it's called, was basically a tax that Britain tried to impose on all printed paper products, newspapers, playing cards, legal documents, etc. What was the reason for doing this? British claim that they're trying to raise funds to protect the American frontier along the Appalachian Mountains by sending 10,000 troops there. The colonists weren't so much mad at this, but mad that this was the British trying to raise money for a project in the Americas. You have an island nation trying to administer an entire continent. They felt largely they didn't need to raise money because they had it. This is the crown. Second, it was passed without the colony's legislature. And of course, the Loyal Nine was the precursor to the formation of the now infamous group, the Sons of Liberty, which leads us into the famous saying, no taxation without representation. The Sons of Liberty, I can tell you that all of the previous groups I've mentioned have had members who joined this one group, designed to protect Boston's people on the streets at any cost. The group formed in 1764 and had many notable members, many of whom were active Freemasons. The group received its name from Isaac Barr when he referred to the colonies as the Sons of Liberty. This is, in fact, the group which planned the Boston Tea Party, and you can guess where they did it: the basement of the Green Dragon Tavern. The next slide is an old parchment. I say note the Masonic emblems. We have a moon, a square and compass, and it's pretty interesting. What it reads on the parchment, it actually says, where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea, dated December 1773, signed John Johnson of Water Street, Boston, Massachusetts, 1773. This slide has caused some controversy, and Masonic historians, other historians will say, well, this doesn't exactly prove that Freemasons planned the Boston Tea Party. We didn't, maybe we had some guys who were involved, but this doesn't say that we planned it. But we have some information on that a little bit later. This is the flag of the Sons of Liberty. It was adopted in 1767, which had 9 uneven vertical stripes representing the Loyal Nine, and they named it the Rebellious. So now I'll take a slight deviation, and I'll just say, for those of you who enjoy a bit of decoding, some conspiracy, or just plain symbology, hidden in plain sight stuff, we can do that just for a moment here. So this flag actually represented the Loyal Nine. So we have 9 upright individuals. So we can then separate these 9 stripes of the rebellious to represent the 9 individuals. But what about the colors red and white? And so for this, we can travel back in time. You can just kind of look at some symbology of the colors, right? So if we travel back, we can look at the Knights Templar. And we have the Templar tunic and shield, which the symbol of the red cross on a white background symbolized, among other things, a warrior's oath and honor-bound commitment to give his life and spill his or anyone's blood for the cause. In their case, Knights Templar was God, Christ, a protection of the path to the Holy Land. We can fast forward to the time of the Loyal Nine, who now had laid down their lives for what they believed in. So we went from vertical to horizontal, and we can bring them back together as they once were. And now let's elongate the stripes into a rectangular shape of flags that we're used to. Then we can add 4 more stripes to represent all 13 colonies. It's a good song. So we've got a normal-sized flag that we're used to, and these guys are the 13 colonies that gave life for our country. And finally, we can add a blue square. A blue square representing, among other things, without limits, as related to the sky or the depths of the sea, truth, and even universality. And finally, we can add the stars representing all 50 great states of our nation. And you've gone from a first 9 upright men who took a stand, lost their lives, and we laid them to rest. And more followed as all 13 colonies joined in. So it's a little fitting, in my opinion, that we see the martyrdom of the brave men, women, and in many cases children who died fighting for the independence that we share today. So, small tangent, back on track. The Green Dragon Tavern is known as the headquarters of the American Revolution by the historians today. One of the most famous Freemasons we have here in North America, Paul Revere, actually left this tavern to start his midnight ride to Lexington. Of course, Paul Revere. The Green Dragon was actually demolished in 1854. Today located at 11 Marshall Street on Boston's North End is a new building titled the same, the Green Dragon Tavern, and they publicly state that they are the headquarters of the American Revolution. So we have an honorable mention. So in my research, many times I run across some neat facts about different places, and sometimes when I hear something absolutely fantastic, I research it only to find out that the claims are false. So on my desk at home, I have a model ship. To be specific, it is the USS Constitution, better known as Old Ironsides. And I've always loved the ship and the stories that were told about her. And about 2 years ago, I became fascinated. I heard a rumor that Grand Master, to be specific, your buddy Paul Revere, had commissioned a lodge right there somewhere on the ship. So there I was thinking about some cool Masonic hidden temple room on a boat, probably very small, just big enough to hold short meetings. However, I contacted the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts some time ago, and they said, nope, not true. However, there is a lodge that meets there on the USS Constitution. It is a military lodge, military Masonic lodge, Henry Knox Lodge. And they meet once a year on the deck of the ship, which was commissioned in 1926 on the 150th anniversary of the British evacuation of Boston. So the name of the lodge, again, the General Henry Knox Lodge, and it is composed of active and veteran armed services. So although the lodge wasn't active in the days of the Revolution, the fact that the ship was in service, fought for our independence, and that a lodge was now meeting there on occasion was a little more than cool. So next, I hope this is my oh my God moment. This is not something that I normally do for the public. It's kind of shared usually for just a few people around the table due to the sensitivity of the documents that I'm going to put up on the screen. I did talk to Walter yesterday from your Grand Lodge historian, who said, go for it. I said, okay. And so, again, going back to the founding of this Boston Tea Party, what happened? And you'll get guys all the time who say, no. They play down the Masonic involvement of the Tea Party and the Masons' involvement. What we've got is a document which was rumored to exist, which were minutes of the lodge, St. Andrew's Lodge, that day. So again, here is this parchment that we've all seen and said, maybe this exists. Maybe this happened, the way we say. But then I received an anonymous email with pictures and a note. And here they are. The minutes, St. Andrew's Lodge. Now, the first part here is about a week or so before the general business was then adjourned. He says down here that they were adjourned due to low turnout. And a note at the bottom, it's hard to read, right, because it's some pretty sweet script. But it does talk about consignment of tea a week before the event. The day of the event, they simply adjourned immediately. So I think more than this one that they adjourned immediately, this proves that we had some involvement. I think this proves that we had an intimate hand, at least at some point, in actual planning. But there were way more than just Freemasons involved in the Boston Tea Party. In conclusion, countless lodges from around the world continue to meet in the manner in which these Masons did. That is, over drinks, having meals, and many of those that cannot typically will meet after the meeting for additional brotherhood and fellowship outside the lodge, perhaps down in a tavern down the street here in Massachusetts. You guys seem to have a really hip thing where you guys maybe can have a beer sometimes. That's kind of nice. Illinois, we can't do that. So we have to travel after lodge. We close. We go down the street and have a drink. Talk about philosophy and the lodge and what we can do in the community to better things. But I'd like to remind everyone that though these buildings and taverns begat some amazing groups that truly shaped this country, the men behind those establishments were upright citizens, and a good deal of them were Freemasons. And more than the often repeated and boring facts that are thrown our way regarding that how many guys signed the Declaration of Independence were Masons, I believe that some of the facts and the stories that I've presented here today probably tell a little bit better of a story of the way that our fraternity has influenced our way of life and the formation of our great country. By exploring the groups and men and the Freemasons which set the example for a country that so many others try to emulate, we see the industry, the fidelity, and the character which makes this country great. And oftentimes we ask ourselves, how could Masons have started a rebellion? A lot of us took an oath which includes allegiance to our country. And this is true, but we also took an oath to be a more important duty, which is to be upright, courageous, and stand for what's right. And we took an oath to relieve the distressed, and at a point in our great nation's history, there was a lot of distress. The taverns which held and hosted our first lodges here in America are gone, but the spirit that was forged within is ever present. The colonial spirit and the fortitude lives on in the fraternity in perpetuity, and while tavern masonry, air quotes, may be a thing of the past, it's far from dead. That's all I got. Thanks, guys.